She was fired before she even set down her bag. 5 minutes late, 1 minute humiliated, and 0 chances left. What no one knew was that the man leaning against the hallway column, the one who didn't say a word, was the real owner of the company. And her story had just begun. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't see that twist coming. It wasn't traffic. It wasn't her alarm. It was the bus driver, an older man with kind eyes, who had stopped mid-route to help an elderly passenger cross the street. Elena Vargas didn't resent him for it. Not really. It was just that kindness, for all its beauty, had cost her everything she'd been holding onto for the last 6 months. A chance. She sprinted the final 2 blocks to Hartwell and Company, shoes slapping the sidewalk, the strap of her thrift store tote digging into her shoulder. Inside it, a folder filled with printed resumes, design sketches, and a trembling kind of hope. The city shimmered with the pale gold of early morning, mocking her urgency. By the time she pushed through the revolving glass doors, she was panting, flushed, a stray hair sticking to her cheek. The lobby gleamed in polished marble and ambition. A chandelier dripped light from the ceiling, the kind that made even fingerprints look like sins. Behind the reception desk, a woman with perfect posture and 0 empathy looked up. Her name tag read Candace. She took in Elena's scuffed heels, the slight sweat on her brow, the way she clutched her folder like it could still save her. "You're late," Candace said. Elena opened her mouth to explain, but before she could speak, a second woman appeared, brisk and efficient, clipboard in hand. The HR manager, tailored blazer, clipped tone, the scent of power and peppermint gum. "Elena Vargas?" "Yes, hi, I'm so sorry, the bus." The woman's expression didn't change. "We value punctuality here. I'm afraid this isn't a good fit." The words hit harder than she expected. No pause, no kindness, no space for context, just dismissal, wrapped in professional courtesy. Please, it was 5 minutes, Elena said, her voice breaking despite her effort to steady it. "The bus—" But the woman was already walking away, her heels a metronome of finality. Elena stood in the middle of the marble floor, the hum of conversation and clinking coffee cups echoing around her like laughter in a dream she couldn't wake from. 5 minutes. That was all it took to erase weeks of preparing, months of scraping by on part-time work and quiet promises to herself that she'd make it. Her throat burned. She managed a small nod to the receptionist, an apology to no one, and turned toward the door. "Next," Candace called cheerfully, as if Elena's rejection had been an errand checked off a list. Outside, she exhaled a shaky breath that caught somewhere between a sob and a laugh. The city roared on, cars honking, people hurrying to places where they were still wanted. She pressed her folder against her chest like it could stop the ache. But as she reached for the glass door, something made her stop. A man leaned against one of the hallway columns near the elevator, watching quietly. No phone in hand, no clipboard, no pretense of busyness. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, tie loosened like he'd been fighting the day before it even began. He wasn't smiling, but his expression wasn't cold either. There was something tired in it, tired but curious. Their eyes met for a moment that felt longer than it was. She dropped her gaze first, cheeks heating. Maybe he'd seen everything, the rejection, the pleading, the humiliation. Maybe he was another executive amused by the new girl's stumble. But as she turned to leave, he did something strange. He straightened, took one quiet breath, and gave the smallest nod. Not pity, not judgment, just a simple human acknowledgement, like he was saying, "I saw what they didn't." Elena walked out into the sunlight that felt harsher now, her heels echoing against the concrete. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that he was the real owner of Hartwell and Company, the man who had built every shining inch of the world that had just pushed her out. She didn't know that he had once been late to his own interview, or that someone else's mercy had changed the course of his life. All she knew was that she'd failed before she'd even begun. And all he knew, standing there in his silence, was that something about her, her trembling hands, her quiet defiance, the way she'd said please even when the world wasn't listening, had stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. He turned toward the elevator, the faintest flicker of thought forming in his chest. 5 minutes late, he thought. Sometimes that's exactly on time. Liam Hartwell didn't look like a man who owned half the skyline. He preferred it that way. The suit jacket stayed on hangers, the chauffeured cars in the garage. He walked to work most mornings, coffee in one hand, his daughter's lunchbox in the other, his tie often forgotten, until he caught his reflection in a window and sighed. People who passed him saw a tired man in rolled sleeves, maybe middle management, maybe someone on his way out rather than in. No one ever guessed that the man with the quiet eyes was the founder whose name glowed in brass above every door, Hartwell and Company. He'd built the company from nothing. 2 decades earlier, it had been sketches on napkins and coffee-stained blueprints scattered across his kitchen table. He'd been 21, hungry, idealistic, certain that design could change how people felt inside a space. Back then, he'd believed that beauty was medicine for loneliness. The first office had been a converted garage with flickering lights and a leaking roof. But he'd worked nights, taught himself architecture software, and poured every ounce of himself into making places that felt like home. Eventually, the world noticed. The garage became a studio, the studio a firm, and the firm an empire. Now, at 39, he sat at the top of that empire, but the air up there was thin, meetings stacked like bricks, profits grew. His designs won awards, yet the joy that had once fueled him was gone, replaced by metrics and deadlines and people who used words like synergy instead of soul. His phone buzzed more than his heart did. He had employees who feared him, investors who admired him, and not a single person in the building who really knew him, except for Ivy. Ivy Hartwell, age 10, freckles like constellations, and opinions far too large for her years. That morning, she'd been sitting at the kitchen counter, spooning cereal and studying him like a scientist observing an extinct species. "Dad," she'd said, tilting her head, "do you even like your company anymore?" The question had hit him harder than any quarterly report. He'd tried to laugh it off, ruffle her hair, tell her that grown-ups don't always have to like what they do, but her eyes, wide and honest, wouldn't let him. He'd kissed her forehead, promised to be home early, and left without really answering. Now, standing in the marble lobby, he realized that maybe the real answer had just walked in, 5 minutes late and full of fire. He saw her before anyone else did. A young woman rushing through the doors, clutching a worn leather folder like it contained her last hope. She was out of breath, cheeks flushed from running, eyes bright with apology. He recognized that look, the kind that only came from people who had nothing left to fall back on. He watched as the receptionist frowned, as the HR manager delivered her scripted lines, as the girl's shoulders slowly sank under the weight of another closed door. And something in Liam stirred, something that had been asleep a long time. It wasn't pity, it was memory. He remembered standing in a different lobby years ago, nervous, broke, waiting for a chance that almost didn't come. He remembered being judged by his clothes, dismissed by a man who thought lateness meant laziness. The only reason he'd been hired that day was because the owner's assistant, an older woman with kind eyes, had whispered, "He reminds me of someone who just needs a door left open." That door had changed everything, and now here he was, watching history repeat itself, only this time he was the one who could open it. The girl, Elena, he caught from the conversation, blinked hard, trying not to cry. When she turned to leave, her expression was a mix of defeat and quiet dignity. She didn't beg, didn't argue. She just nodded, gathered what was left of her pride, and walked away. Liam's jaw tightened. Around him, the world kept spinning, phones ringing, heels clicking, voices rising. But all he heard was the sound of possibility walking out the door. He could have stopped her right then, introduced himself, offered an apology, a job, a lifeline. But instead he did what he always did when the world disappointed him. He went still. He watched her disappear through the glass doors, sunlight wrapping around her like the city was trying to keep her. And for the first time in years, he felt something real pulse beneath all the noise, regret mixed with recognition. She reminded him of who he used to be before success dulled his edges, before he traded risk for structure, before every decision had to go through 3 departments and a boardroom. He straightened, loosened his tie completely, and muttered under his breath, 5 minutes late, maybe right on time, because in that fleeting moment of silence, Liam Hartwell, the man who had everything, realized he might have just watched the one thing he didn't know he'd been missing. The alley behind Hartwell and Company didn't match the elegance of the lobby. It smelled faintly of rain, rust, and the kind of dreams that never made it past the front desk. Elena sat on the cracked concrete, her back against a wall still damp from last night's drizzle, the city noise reduced to a dull hum. The tears she'd fought so hard to hide finally came, cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. She pressed her palms against her face, breathing in shallow bursts. First day, first chance, gone before she could even prove she belonged. She wasn't the type to cry in public, but there was something about being alone in that gray corner that stripped her of the little pride she had left. Her folder, her whole future, lay half open beside her, pages curling from moisture, sketches she'd drawn late at night after shifts at the diner, her resume printed at a public library, a cover letter that sounded far more confident than she felt. All of it looked small now, like scraps of hope. Rough day? The voice was quiet, careful, like whoever spoke it knew the cost of being startled while broken. She looked up fast, eyes wide, defensive. A man stood a few feet away, a paper cup of coffee in one hand. His sleeves were rolled, tie loose, the faint sheen of sweat on his temples suggesting he'd been moving, not supervising. "You could say that," she muttered, swiping at her face, "if you enjoy watching your career die before lunch." He smiled a little, not in pity but recognition, and crouched down beside her. "Coffee?" She hesitated. He didn't look like a threat, more like someone who'd lost a few fights of his own. She accepted the cup, the vending machine kind that tasted more like burnt plastic than caffeine, but it was warm. "They shouldn't have done that to you," he said. "You saw?" He nodded. "Yeah. They said I was late." Her laugh was thin and tired. 5 minutes. You'd think I'd tripped a fire alarm. "Sometimes people confuse power with purpose," he said, glancing at the ground. She studied him. "You work here?" "Sometimes." He smiled faintly, as if the truth was a flexible thing. "Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing, I guess." Something in the way he said it made her curious, but she didn't press. There was a steadiness about him, an ease that didn't match the chaos of the building behind them. They sat for a while, the city breathing around them. She told him about how she'd applied everywhere, how every "we'll call you" felt like another lie she had to pretend to believe. He listened without interrupting, eyes soft, hands resting loosely on his knees. When he finally spoke, his tone was gentle. "You mentioned design." "What kind?" "Interior," she said. "Mostly small spaces, homes, cafes. I like making things feel like someone belongs there." He nodded slowly. "That's rare. Most people just decorate." She tilted her head. "And what do you do when you're not whatever you are here?" He smiled again, that small, unreadable smile. "I think about spaces too." They talked about color, light, the way a room could change a person's mood, about how the right kind of silence could make someone feel seen. The conversation flowed easily, surprising both of them. For a brief moment she forgot she was sitting beside a dumpster. When the clouds began to gather again, Elena stood, brushing dust off her skirt. "Thanks for the coffee," she said. He stood too. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends on what it is." "You got a number?" "You mentioned you do design work. There's a project I'd like you to see." She hesitated, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," he said simply. "I just think maybe the right person's been getting overlooked." It wasn't the words, but the way he said them, like someone who meant every syllable. She reached into her folder, pulled out one of her bent business cards, and handed it to him. "Don't make me regret that," she said, forcing a small smile. "I won't," he replied. She walked away then, her shoulders still slumped, but her pace slower, steadier. He watched her until she turned the corner, the faint echo of her footsteps blending with the city's pulse. Liam looked down at the card in his hand. Elena Vargas, interior design consultant. The ink was slightly smudged, but the name was clear, strong. He smiled to himself, tucking it into his pocket. Behind him, the dumpsters hummed with the low rhythm of the city, unaware that between concrete and spilled coffee, something extraordinary had just begun. The message came early on a gray Thursday morning, tucked between bills and promotional texts she didn't remember signing up for. "You free tomorrow? I have a space that could use your eye." No name, but she knew who it was. She read it twice, coffee cooling in her hand. A week had passed since the alley, since the vending machine coffee, since the stranger with tired eyes and soft words who'd seen her when no one else had. She should have deleted the text, she told herself. Probably some small favor, probably not worth the bus fare. But something in her refused to ignore it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was hope pretending to be curiosity. The next morning she arrived at the address he'd sent. A quiet side street on the edge of downtown. The building looked abandoned from the outside. Its sign faded, windows streaked with the kind of grime that told stories about rain and neglect. Inside it was silent, the kind of silence that holds its breath waiting to be noticed. Liam was already there, sleeves rolled, hands tucked in his pockets, standing under a beam of pale light from a cracked skylight. "You came," he said simply. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "Glad you changed your mind." He led her through the echoing hallway until they reached a wide room with high ceilings and dust motes drifting lazily in the air. A faint smell of paint and forgotten ambition lingered. Blueprints lay scattered across a long drafting table, their edges curled and yellowed. An overturned chair sat in one corner, a coffee mug fossilized on the floor. "What is this place?" she asked. "Studio C," he said. "Used to be our experimental branch. Young designers, wild ideas, no limits. I started it 2 years ago, then life happened, and I stopped showing up. The others followed." She looked around slowly, taking in the bones of the space, the glass walls, the metal framework, the old design board still pinned with fabric samples and handwritten notes. "It looks like someone gave up," she said quietly. He smiled faintly, leaning against the railing. "Maybe they just got lost." Elena crouched beside one of the tables, brushing her fingers over a stack of sketches half buried under dust. "These are good," she murmured. "They just need light again." She stood, pulled a hair tie from her wrist, and twisted her hair into a loose knot. "All right," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's find it again." Liam watched her move through the room, quick, instinctive, unafraid of the mess. She opened blinds, cracked a window, and dragged a chair into the center of the floor. When she found a marker, she started sketching directly onto the glass wall, lines and swirls and arrows forming ideas as she spoke them aloud. "If you take down half this partition, the space breathes. That corner could be a collab zone, soft textures, low light, warmth. And this," she tapped a column with her marker, "this wants to be color." "Wants to be?" he asked. She smiled over her shoulder. "Rooms talk if you listen." He couldn't help it. He laughed, the sound surprising even himself. She looked back at him, one eyebrow raised, but there was no judgment in her eyes, just something steady, grounded, real. For the next few hours, they worked side by side. She organized the scattered prints, he cleared the tables. She mixed paint samples on a scrap of cardboard, debating tones that made the air feel different. When she caught him staring too long, he pretended to study the skylight. By mid-afternoon, sunlight had found its way through the newly cleaned windows, stretching across the floor in gold streaks. The room looked different, alive, even in its half-finished state. Elena leaned against a stool, arms crossed, dust on her cheeks and laughter in her voice. "There," she said. "Not perfect, but breathing." Liam nodded slowly. "You do realize you just made a forgotten studio feel like home?" She shrugged. "I just gave it permission." They stood in silence for a moment. The kind that doesn't need filling. She didn't know that this place was part of him, his failure, his unfinished thought. And he didn't tell her that she'd just reminded him what creation felt like. By sundown, color swatches covered the walls. Pencils rolled across tables. Coffee cups, real ones, not vending machine kind, sat between sketches. Elena sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through old portfolios, her laughter soft but certain, like someone rediscovering a piece of themselves they thought was gone. Liam stood in the corner, hands in his pockets, watching. He saw something in her that he hadn't seen in months, in years, maybe. Not just talent, not even resilience, life. The kind that turns empty spaces into something that matters. The last of the sunlight spilled through the windows, catching the streak of color she'd brushed across one wall, warm amber, imperfect and brilliant. And as he watched her there, barefoot, paint on her hands, heart in her work, he realized that the woman who'd been fired for being 5 minutes late was somehow, impossibly, right on time. Rumors have a strange way of finding oxygen in quiet places. By the end of the week, Hartwell and company had already decided what to make of Elena Vargas. The girl who'd been fired on her first day was back, unofficially, of course. Some said it was charity, others said scandal. A few whispered about an affair with a man they couldn't name. None of them knew the truth, and she didn't have the energy to correct them. Elena worked like someone racing a deadline that didn't exist. She showed up early, stayed late, skipped lunch. The forgotten studio had begun to breathe again, windows open, laughter echoing off half-painted walls, the hum of life sneaking back into a building that had been running on routine instead of passion. Liam came and went quietly. He never issued orders, never pulled rank, never spoke like a man with power. He just listened, asked questions, brought coffee, and when she forgot to eat, he'd leave a sandwich on her desk with a note that only said, "Keep going." The others noticed. They always do. More than once, Elena caught glances from passing staff, curious, judgmental, confused. The whispers followed her down hallways, fluttering like paper behind her. "That's her," someone would murmur. "The janitor's project. The CEO's distraction. The charity case." She let them talk, let them believe whatever made sense in their world of titles and hierarchies, because what she had with Liam didn't belong to that world. It was something simpler, rarer, two people building something honest in a place that had forgotten how. One afternoon, the studio smelled like fresh paint and redemption. A spill had turned into laughter, a small war between her paintbrush and his clumsy attempt at helping. A streak of cobalt blue ran across his wrist. "You're hopeless," she teased. "I'm evolving," he said, reaching for a rag. "And for the record, this shade suits me," she grinned. "You look like a sad Picasso." Their laughter bounced through the room light and unguarded until the door creaked open. "Sir?" The word sliced through the air like a misplaced chord. An executive in a tailored suit stood frozen in the doorway, holding a clipboard like a shield. His eyes flicked between them, Elena's paint-splattered hands, Liam's rolled sleeves, their closeness. "Shouldn't staff requests go through HR?" the man asked carefully. "I can arrange, Liam's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." The executive hesitated, confusion flashing behind his professionalism. "Of course, sir." He backed out of the room, the door clicking shut with finality. Elena stood still. The echo of that single word hung heavy between them. "Sir." She turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "What did he just call you?" Liam exhaled, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "Elena." "Sir," she repeated. "As in, what exactly? You're not just an employee, are you?" He met her gaze, the truth quietly surfacing in the lines around his eyes. "Not exactly." The silence that followed wasn't angry, it was fragile. A slow unraveling of the unspoken rules that had bound their easy companionship. "You're the owner," she said finally. It wasn't a question. He didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. His stillness said everything. She let out a shaky breath, the air thick with disbelief. "You let me think you were, what, maintenance? Some helpful stranger who happened to hang around the same building?" He took a cautious step toward her. "I wasn't lying. I just didn't tell you what I owned." "Which is everything," she said softly, "including the room I thought was mine." He shook his head. "That studio was dead long before you walked in. You didn't take it. You gave it life again." The words landed between them, heavy and true. Elena looked down at the floor, at the streaks of color they'd spilled hours earlier, his fingerprints, her brushstrokes, tangled proof of a story that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly, "but if I had, you wouldn't have stayed." She didn't answer, didn't know how. The distance between them suddenly felt wider than the entire company. When the elevator doors closed behind her that evening, the sound of it echoed through the empty hallway like a secret escaping its keeper. Inside, Liam stood alone in the quiet studio, watching the last slant of sunlight fall across the wall they'd painted together. Her laughter still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. He pressed his thumb against the dried blue stain on his wrist, the only evidence that something real had existed in this polished world of glass and titles. He didn't know it yet, but that silence, the one she left behind, wasn't an ending. It was the start of everything that would make him remember what love looked like when it wasn't dressed in power. The invitation came on a quiet Friday evening, tucked between apologies he never quite said and honesty he couldn't yet afford. "My daughter wants her room to feel less lonely," he'd written. No signature, no flourish, just that. Elena almost didn't go. Part of her still smarted from the revelation that he wasn't who she thought he was. The janitor, the listener, the man who handed her coffee by the dumpsters, he'd turned out to be the owner of Hartwell and Company, a man whose name signed the paychecks of people who whispered behind her back. Yet, when she reread his message, something softer pushed through her anger, less lonely. It wasn't the request of a CEO, it was the plea of a father. She took the train across town, the city shifting from concrete gray to quiet green, until the skyline gave way to the kind of neighborhood that never had to worry about rent. When the cab stopped in front of the house, she hesitated on the walkway, staring at the tall glass windows framed by ivy and late afternoon light. It wasn't what she expected, not ostentatious or cold. The place breathed wood, stone, air, everything deliberate but lived in. Liam opened the door himself, sleeves rolled as usual. "You came," he said simply. "I almost didn't," she replied. "I figured," he said with a small, almost sheepish smile. "But I'm glad you did." Inside, the scent of citrus and paint lingered faintly in the air. The space felt like him, orderly, quiet, but full of echoes. A wall of framed sketches caught her eye near the hallway. Blueprints, floor plans, even a few portraits. She paused, recognizing the lines, his lines, delicate but certain. Before she could ask, a small voice floated from the staircase. "Dad?" A girl appeared, 10, maybe 11, with loose brown curls and eyes too wise for her age. She clutched a stuffed fox like it was a passport to safety. "Ivy," Liam said, his tone softening instantly. "This is Miss Vargas." She's going to help with your room. Ivy's gaze flicked from her father to Elena. You're the lady from Dad's sketches. Elena blinked. Sketches? Liam rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly fascinated by the floor. I draw ideas sometimes. Helps me think. Ivy giggled. You draw her a lot. He shot his daughter a look that begged for mercy. Elena said nothing, but her heart shifted, the edges of her resentment blurring. They spent the next few hours in Ivy's room, light pouring through open curtains, boxes stacked against walls, the faint sound of music drifting from somewhere downstairs. The space was big but bare, painted in neutral tones that made it feel more like a guest room than a child's sanctuary. What do you want it to feel like? Elena asked gently. Ivy tilted her head. Like when you're not scared of the dark. Like the dark is your friend. Elena smiled. That's poetic. It's true, Ivy said earnestly. Dad says stars are what happens when the dark gets brave enough to shine. Liam's voice came from behind them. I said that once, when she couldn't sleep. Then we'll give her stars, Elena said. By nightfall, they had transformed the space. The ceiling was dotted with constellations painted in soft silver, the walls a calming twilight blue. Ivy had insisted on helping, smudging more paint on herself than the wall. They built a small reading nook by the window, draped fairy lights across the curtain rod, and rearranged the furniture so her bed faced the open sky. When it was done, Ivy climbed onto the bed, her face glowing in the gentle light. It feels like I'm sleeping inside a wish, she whispered. Minutes later she was asleep, the stuffed fox tucked under her arm, her breathing steady beneath the painted stars. Elena stepped back, wiping a stray streak of silver from her wrist. Liam stood beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze soft. You listen differently, she said after a while. He turned his head slightly. What do you mean? Most people talk to be heard, she said. You talk to understand. He smiled faintly, that quiet, self-effacing smile that always seemed to carry more weight than words. Maybe I just finally found something worth listening to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house was silent except for the hum of the night settling in, the whisper of leaves outside, the gentle rhythm of Ivy's breathing. The air between them felt fragile, like something they could ruin if they moved too fast. Elena glanced toward the ceiling one last time. You know, she murmured, for someone who pretends not to care about beauty, you live surrounded by it. He looked at her then, really looked. The paint on her hands, the tired grace in her eyes, the warmth she'd left in a room that used to echo. It wasn't beautiful until tonight, he said softly. She didn't answer. She just smiled, small and genuine, and for the first time since walking into that house, she didn't feel like an employee or even a guest. She felt like someone who'd helped two lonely hearts remember what light looked like. By Monday morning, the boardroom of Hartwell and Company felt more like a courtroom. The air was thick with accusation, the kind that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fear. A dozen directors sat around the long glass table, their faces polished into neutrality, but their eyes sharp with something else, judgment. They had all seen the same leaked photos. Liam Hartwell standing beside a paint-splattered woman in a forgotten studio, sleeves rolled, a streak of blue on his wrist. To them it was scandal. To him it was honesty. The head of PR was the first to speak, his voice clipped and practiced. We're facing a perception issue, Liam. The story is spreading. CEO saves struggling artist he fired. The internet loves it, but investors don't. They're asking if your judgment's been compromised. Liam leaned back in his chair, calm on the surface, though something underneath him flickered, something restless and done with politeness. Compromised, he repeated. Interesting choice of word. Another board member, an older woman with diamond cuffs and a sharper tongue, adjusted her glasses. We're not saying you've done anything wrong, Liam. But this woman, this Elena, she's not staff anymore. You brought her back without consulting anyone. You're personally funding her project. And now employees are whispering about favoritism. He let them talk, let the noise build around him like static. They spoke about numbers, brand value, reputation, all the things that once made his heart race and now only made him tired. Optics matter, the PR head said finally, folding his hands as if sealing a deal. Investors will question your leadership if you continue to blur the lines between personal and professional. We're advising you to distance yourself immediately. End this association before it costs us. Liam's gaze moved slowly around the table. The men and women before him were brilliant, ruthless, loyal, in the way people are loyal to profit. He'd sat beside them for years, playing the same game, wearing the same armor. But somewhere between the echo of paint laughter in Studio C and the look on his daughter's face when she'd fallen asleep under her painted stars, he'd realized he didn't care for armor anymore. He leaned forward slightly, voice low but steady. "Do you know why I started this company?" A few exchanged glances. The head of finance cleared his throat. "To innovate design accessibility," he recited, as if quoting a brochure. Liam smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, I started it because when I was 21, I wanted to build spaces that made people feel. Not just look, not just buy. Feel. I wanted beauty that belonged to everyone, not just the ones who could afford it." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. We all did. You talk about optics, but when did we stop talking about meaning?" "Meaning doesn't pay salaries," someone muttered. "No," he said, "but it's why people stay." The PR head sighed, irritation creeping in. "You're risking your credibility for one woman. Is she really worth that risk?" Liam stood then, pushing his chair back quietly. His reflection stared up at him from the polished glass table. Tired eyes, loosened tie, the man he used to be finally visible again. "She's not a risk," he said. "She's the reminder of why I built this company in the first place. For people who believe in beauty, not bureaucracy. For people who still think 5 minutes late isn't the same as 5 years behind." No one spoke. The board members shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the kind of conviction that couldn't be debated. He could see it in their faces. They didn't understand. Not really. They couldn't comprehend that after all the zeros, all the accolades, the thing that still mattered most to him was the pulse of purpose. The head of operations cleared his throat. "Liam, this isn't about ideals. It's about stability." He met the man's eyes. "Stability is what you call it when you've stopped caring." The room went silent again. Phones buzzed quietly. Someone's pen clicked twice, nervous. Liam straightened his jacket, though he wasn't sure why. "I appreciate your concern," he said finally, "but I'd rather lose investors than lose integrity." And with that he turned and walked out. No slammed doors, no grand speech, just footsteps fading down the corridor, steady and sure. Outside the glass walls, the city pulsed with life, chaotic, imperfect, real. He breathed it in. Somewhere across town, he imagined Elena bent over a sketch, paint on her hands, unaware that she had just shaken an empire back into motion. For the first time in years, Liam Hartwell wasn't thinking about balance sheets or quarterly projections. He was thinking about truth, and how good it felt to finally make the right kind of noise. The headline was impossible to miss. Bold, sensational, cruel in its precision. CEO's secret project raises eyebrows. The photo below it made her stomach twist. It was Liam, caught mid-left beside her in the studio, sleeves rolled, hands smudged with blue paint. The caption read, "Hartwell and company's elusive founder invests personally in a mysterious new designer." They didn't even bother to use her name, just a mysterious new designer. Elena froze in the middle of her tiny apartment, the morning light slanting through half-closed blinds, catching on the edge of her coffee cup. She reread the article 3 times, each sentence cutting deeper. It wasn't just the words, it was what they confirmed. He hadn't been a colleague, a quiet mentor, a stranger who'd believed in her work. He had been the boss, The man who'd built the empire that had spit her out like an inconvenience. The man who'd watched her humiliation unfold and said nothing. Her chest burned with betrayal. Every conversation, every shared glance in the studio replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. The way he'd listened, the way he'd watched. All of it suddenly felt like performance, a test she hadn't agreed to take. By the time she reached the studio, the halls of Hartwell and Company felt sharper, colder. People who had once whispered now stared openly. She could hear them behind her as she walked. That's her, the one in the article. The door to Studio C was half open, the familiar scent of paint and dust greeting her like a ghost. Liam was there, leaning over a table, reviewing sketches. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted instantly, relief first, then recognition of the storm in her eyes. "Elena, you lied to me," she said. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from fury fighting its way through heartbreak. He straightened slowly. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you everything. That's a convenient philosophy." She stepped closer, her pulse thudding in her ears. "You watched me get humiliated on my first day. You saw them fire me like I was disposable, and you said nothing. You let me think you were just another worker. You let me open up to you, trust you." Her voice cracked. "You let me feel safe with you." He exhaled, the sound low and tired. "I wanted to see who you were without the job, without the title. I needed to know what drove you when no one was watching." Her laugh came out sharp, bitter. "You needed to know what I was? You think I'm an experiment? Some case study for your next big speech on authenticity?" "No," he said, quiet but firm. "I needed to know what I had become." That stopped her for a moment. He took a cautious step closer, voice softer now. "This company used to mean something to me. It was built on passion, not policy. But I forgot. I forgot what it felt like to create, to care. Then you walked in, 5 minutes late, furious, unpolished, and you reminded me why I ever started. I wasn't saving you, Elena." He swallowed hard. "I was learning how to save myself." She wanted to believe him. God, a part of her already did. But the anger was louder than the ache. "You had no right," she said, her tone sharp again. "No right to test me, to manipulate me, to make me feel like what we built here meant something real. It was real." "Not to me," she whispered. "Not anymore." The silence between them thickened. The hum of the city outside seemed to fade. He looked at her then, not as the CEO, not even as the man who'd broken her trust, but as someone who'd just lost something irreplaceable. She turned before he could speak again. Her footsteps echoed against the concrete, steady but heavy. When she reached the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the frame. For a heartbeat, she almost looked back, but she didn't. The door closed behind her with a hollow sound that filled the studio like the final note of a song that would never be finished. Liam stood there for a long time, staring at the space she'd just left, her unfinished sketches still scattered across the table. He reached out, tracing one of the pencil lines she'd drawn days ago, one that curved like hope and ended abruptly in white space. Some dreams, he realized, don't shatter when they collide. They just split, half buried in regret, half waiting for the courage to start again. Days moved differently after she left. Longer, heavier, quieter. The kind of quiet that doesn't just fill a space, but settles into it, like dust on untouched furniture. The studio that once buzzed with life and color now stood hollow. Even the air seemed to hesitate, unsure whether it was still welcome there. Liam tried to bury himself in work. The board was thrilled, of course. Finally, their CEO was back where he belonged. Meetings, calls, reports, dinners with investors. The world of money and metrics welcomed him with open arms, but he felt like a guest at his own table. Every number, every presentation, every handshake rang hollow. His mind kept drifting back to Studio C, her laughter bouncing off its walls, the soft scratch of her pencil on glass, the smell of fresh paint. He wondered if she had any idea how much life she'd poured into that forgotten room and how much she'd taken with her when she walked out. At home, even Ivy noticed. It was late afternoon when she padded into his office, her stuffed fox tucked under one arm, her expression serious in that way only children can be. "Did you lose her, Dad?" Liam looked up from the spreadsheet he hadn't actually been reading. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. "The lady from your sketches," Ivy said simply. He leaned back in his chair, sighing softly. "Maybe." Ivy tilted her head, studying him. "Are you going to find her?" He smiled sadly. "Not everyone wants to be found." She walked closer, setting her fox on the desk beside his papers. "Maybe she doesn't want to be found by you." "But maybe she wants to be heard." He looked at her, startled. Ivy had a way of saying things that left no room for defense, only reflection. She was so much like her mother that sometimes it hurt. That night, after Ivy had gone to bed and the house had gone still, Liam sat in the dark of his living room, staring out at the city lights. They blurred through the window, like stars seen under water. He told himself he wasn't going back, that it wouldn't matter, that Studio C was just a space, a physical reminder of a mistake, nothing more. But somewhere between denial and exhaustion, his body decided for him. Minutes later, he found himself standing in the elevator, tie loosened, jacket over his arm. The ride up felt endless, the kind of climb that carried more weight than gravity could explain. When the doors opened, the smell hit him first. Paint, dust, the faint trace of her perfume still clinging to the air like a ghost that refused to leave. The lights flickered to life reluctantly, casting soft shadows across the room. Her sketches were still everywhere, pinned to boards, taped to walls, scattered across tables. Half-finished designs stared back at him like questions left unanswered. A mug sat abandoned near the window, the rim stained with lipstick. He walked to the center of the room, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until it left him in one long exhale. Everything about the studio felt like her, messy, alive, unfinished. And without her, it felt wrong, as if the room itself was grieving. He reached for one of the sketches, fingertips tracing the outline of her handwriting along the margins, notes about light placement, color balance, rhythm of space. She wrote like she spoke, with feeling, without fear of being too much. He remembered the first day she'd walked in here, brushing dust off the tables, rolling up her sleeves like the mess didn't scare her. "It looks like someone gave up," she'd said. He'd answered, "Maybe they just got lost." Now, standing in the silence she left behind, he finally whispered to the empty room, "You were right." It did look like someone gave up. The sound of his own voice startled him. It felt too human for a place that had become a museum of absence. He sat down on the edge of the drafting table, elbows on his knees, staring at the sketches strewn before him. He tried to picture her, what she might be doing, where she might be. Maybe she was painting again. Maybe she was smiling at someone else's words. Maybe she had already started over. He wanted to be angry at her for leaving, but all he could feel was gratitude for having known what it felt like when she was near. She had made him remember what it meant to care, not as a leader, not as a father, but as a man. When he finally stood, the clock on the wall read past midnight. He turned off the lights, leaving the studio bathed in moonlight. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he took one last look through the narrow slit between them, the sketches, the colors, the echoes. For a second, he swore he saw her reflection flicker in the glass, smiling faintly, as if forgiving him for being too late. Then she was gone again, and the doors sealed the silence. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and second chances. It wasn't glamorous, just a narrow corner shop tucked between a florist and a bookstore, but it was hers for now. A freelance redesign gig, the kind that barely paid rent, but at least kept her busy enough not to think too much. She'd painted the walls a soft cream, swapped the flickering bulbs for warm gold light, and filled the empty shelves with mismatched pottery from thrift stores. It was quiet work, honest work, and the kind that let her lose herself in something that didn't carry his shadow. Elena liked coming in early, before the city woke, when the only sounds were the hiss of the espresso machine and the occasional soft hum of jazz playing from the old speaker in the corner. The cafe owner, a man named Marco with laugh lines and the patience of someone who'd seen too many broken hearts walk through his door, handed her a mug of coffee one morning and said, "You've got a secret admirer." She frowned, half smiling. "What are you talking about?" He nodded toward the counter where a small folded piece of paper sat tucked beneath a sugar jar. "Some guy's been leaving notes for you." Elena hesitated before picking it up. The paper was thick, torn from a sketch pad, the handwriting careful but uncertain, like someone out of practice. She unfolded it slowly. "You taught me to see again. -L." Her breath caught. She stared at the single sentence for a long time, trying to convince herself it could be anyone, just coincidence, another L in a city full of them. But her chest tightened all the same. She slipped the note into her bag without a word. The next week, another appeared, this time folded neatly beside the register where she always placed her coffee order. "You said color makes people feel. I feel everything." She ran her thumb over the ink, tracing each letter. It wasn't grand or poetic, but it was him. She could hear it, the cadence of his voice in the rhythm of those words. Measured, thoughtful, real. She didn't tell Marco or the baristas. Didn't tell anyone. She just kept the notes, one after another, each week one waiting for her. The third one read, "I didn't realize silence could sound like regret until you left." The fourth, "If you walk away to protect your heart, I'll wait to learn how to deserve it." By the fifth, she wasn't sure if she wanted them to stop or never end. That morning, rain tapped softly against the cafe windows. She sat in her usual corner, sketchbook open but blank, her coffee cooling beside her. The note lay unfolded on the table. "You once said the right light can change everything. I'm still standing in the dark, waiting for yours." Her eyes blurred before she could finish reading. Tears fell silently, tracing paths down her cheeks, small and uninvited but unstoppable. She pressed her fingers against her mouth, not out of sadness, but something deeper, something like forgiveness trying to make its way through the ache. The barista noticed, a young woman with pink hair and a kind smile. She approached quietly, setting a napkin beside Elena's cup. "Whoever he is," she said softly, "he means it." Elena nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," she whispered, "he does." The girl smiled and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Outside, the rain thickened, streaking down the glass in uneven lines that distorted the world beyond, like the city itself was trying to remember how to be clear again. Elena looked at the note once more, then at her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her wasn't the one who'd been fired or pitied. She was someone who had rebuilt her life, one coat of paint, one sketch, one scar at a time. Still, the ache in her chest pulsed with something dangerously close to longing. Her phone sat face down beside her. She stared at it for what felt like forever before finally picking it up. Her fingers hovered over his name in her contacts, Liam Hartwell. She hadn't deleted it, though she'd told herself she should. The screen stayed still. The cursor blinked in the empty message field, waiting. She could almost hear his voice again, quiet, steady, saying the words he'd spoken that night when Ivy fell asleep under painted stars. "Maybe I just finally found something worth listening to." Her thumb trembled above the keyboard. The cafe door opened behind her, a rush of cold air spilling in. She didn't turn around, not yet. But for the first time in weeks, she let her heart move before her mind could stop it. Her hand reached for the phone anyway. The gala was the kind of night designed to impress people who no longer knew how to feel impressed. Chandeliers glowed like captured stars. Violins filled the pauses where sincerity should have been, and the walls shimmered with too much gold and too little warmth. Hartwell and Company's annual charity fundraiser had always been Liam's stage, a night for handshakes, headlines, and the illusion that everything was fine. But that night, the lights felt too bright, the laughter too rehearsed, the tuxedo on his shoulders too heavy. He smiled for the cameras, the press, the board, the perfect founder, the visionary, the man who had it all. But beneath the polished charm, something hollow rattled. Every time someone raised a glass to toast him, he thought of the sound of her voice when she'd said, "You lied to me." He thought of Studio C, silent, covered in dust, still holding the ghost of her work. "Mr. Hartwell, over here," a photographer called. Flashbulbs burst, freezing his practiced smile into permanence. To them, he was a headline in motion. CEO triumphs again after controversy. They didn't see the tiredness in his eyes, the one truth he couldn't spin into profit. As the speeches began, he drifted through the crowd like a man moving through his own museum, people admiring what he'd built, none of them noticing the cracks. He stopped by a table, pretending to listen as someone praised his leadership, but his attention flicked toward the entrance every few seconds. He didn't even know what he was waiting for anymore. Maybe closure, maybe her, maybe both. Then he saw her. At first he thought he was imagining it. The trick of light, the way the blue of her dress blended with the shadowed corners of the room. But then she stepped forward, shoulders squared, holding a rolled set of blueprints in one hand. No jewelry, no pretension, just Elena, real in a room full of performance. The noise of the gala dimmed around him, everything blurring into the background as she walked toward him. Liam forgot the cameras, forgot the investors, forgot the entire room. He only saw her. When she stopped in front of him, she didn't smile. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried a storm. "I didn't come for the gala," she said, her voice low but steady. "I came to return your notes." He looked down. She was holding the folded pages, the ones he'd left at the cafe. He could see his own handwriting, creased and worn, like confessions handled too many times. His throat tightened. "Then I'll stop writing," he said quietly, "if you'll start staying." Her lips trembled. "You hurt me. I know." His voice cracked around the words, "And I'd spend the rest of my life earning back your trust if you'd let me try." For a moment neither moved. The lights from the chandeliers shimmered across her face, catching the faint sheen of tears she refused to let fall. Around them, the crowd carried on, talking, laughing, drinking, unaware that in the center of the noise something fragile and extraordinary was happening. Cameras flashed again. He didn't care. Let them take their pictures. Let them spin their stories. None of them would capture what he saw, her eyes softening, her defenses faltering, the quiet flicker of forgiveness that felt more powerful than applause. She exhaled shakily. "You make promises like they're easy to keep." "They're not," he said. "But I've kept one before." Her brow furrowed. "Which one?" "To always show up when something matters." The answer landed between them like a truth neither could undo. For a heartbeat she looked away, glancing toward the room filled with people who expected perfection. And then, with the smallest nod, she met his eyes again. "This doesn't fix everything," she said softly. "I wouldn't want it to," he replied. "I just want a chance to build something honest." Silence stretched. Not cold this time, just tender, trembling, human. Somewhere nearby, applause erupted as a donor announced a record-breaking contribution, but the real moment, the one no one clapped for, happened right there between them. Elena's fingers loosened around the blueprints. The edges brushed against his hand before she let go. "You still have work to do," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but this time, I want to do it with you." The cameras caught the image. A man in a tuxedo, a woman in blue, standing close enough for the world to speculate. But no headline would ever name it right. Because what passed between them wasn't scandal or spectacle. It was forgiveness, quiet and real, disguised as a beginning. The first time Elena stood before the boardroom table, she almost laughed at the irony. Months ago, she'd been fired in this very building for being 5 minutes late. Now she was standing in the same tower, holding a folder of blueprints that might change everything. Her palms were damp, her heartbeat uneven, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "We call it Haven," she said. The words hung in the air, simple but certain. The room full of executives exchanged curious glances, waiting for her to explain. Liam sat at the far end, sleeves rolled, eyes focused entirely on her. It was the first board meeting she'd ever been invited to, and for a moment she thought she might faint under the weight of all those expensive stares. But she took a breath and continued. "Haven is a non-profit design branch," she said, sliding a series of photos across the table. "Our team would restore neglected spaces, shelters, schools, community centers, places that should feel safe but don't. Design isn't just about luxury, it's about dignity, and dignity belongs everywhere." A few board members shifted in their seats. One cleared his throat. Another frowned, his pen tapping impatiently against his notepad. "And how exactly," a gray-haired director asked, "does this benefit Hartwell and Company?" Elena met his gaze. "It doesn't," she said. "Not in the way you mean. It won't increase stock value or attract investors, but it will remind people what Hartwell stands for, or what it should stand for." A quiet murmur rippled across the room. The PR head smirked. "So, charity? You're suggesting we pour company resources into goodwill projects that don't generate profit?" Elena hesitated only long enough to glance toward Liam. His expression didn't waver. Encouragement lived in the soft crease of his smile. "Not charity," she said. "Connection. You build towers, yes, but those towers overlook neighborhoods that are crumbling. What if Hartwell could build something that didn't scrape the sky, but touched the ground instead?" The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it was charged, the kind that meant something had struck a nerve. Finally, a younger director, one of the few who'd always admired Liam's risk-taking, leaned forward. "It's a strong concept," he said carefully, "but it'll need backing, visibility, clear management." His gaze shifted to Liam. "It's a gamble." Liam stood. "Then let's gamble." The room stilled. He moved toward the projector, his voice calm but resolute. "You've all seen what we can build. Towers, resorts, museums. But if all we ever make are spaces for the wealthy, then we're just rearranging beauty where it's already abundant." He looked directly at Elena. "If we can build towers, we can build hope." No one clapped. They never did, but something shifted in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement that leadership had just taken a shape they didn't entirely understand. By the end of the month, Haven was approved as an experimental branch of Hartwell and Company. They gave it a small budget, smaller staff, and even smaller expectations. But that didn't matter. Elena had learned that great things rarely began with applause. She worked night after night assembling her team, students, freelancers, retired architects who'd lost faith in the system, but not in people. They turned an unused wing of the Hartwell building into Haven's first office, stripping down corporate walls, adding warmth and color, refusing to let perfection suffocate authenticity. When the first project launched, a redesign of a local women's shelter, Elena stood in the entranceway, watching as sunlight spilled across freshly painted walls. Volunteers hung framed artwork made by the residents. One little girl traced her hand along the new wallpaper and whispered, "It feels like home." Elena had to turn away for a second, swallowing the lump in her throat. Outside, Liam watched from a distance, letting her have the moment. He could have stepped in, could have claimed the spotlight like every CEO before him. But this was hers, the idea, the fight, the victory. Later that week, as the Hartwell employees toured Haven's new space, someone whispered, "That's the woman who started it." And for the first time, Elena didn't shrink. She didn't look down, didn't apologize for taking up space. She walked the hallways of Hartwell and Company, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who had built her own doorway. The world might still whisper, the headlines might still twist their story, but in the quiet rhythm of Haven's new walls, there was something stronger than approval. There was belonging. The house had changed. It was in the small things at first, the music that played quietly in the kitchen again, the way laughter had started to sneak back into corners where silence used to live. Even the light seemed different, warmer somehow. Ivy noticed before anyone else did. Kids always do. She saw it in her father's smile, how it reached his eyes now, not forced, not polite, but alive. She saw it in the way he moved through the house, less like a ghost, more like someone returning home from a long absence he hadn't meant to take. Elena had become part of that rhythm, gently, without trying. She didn't fill the space, she blended with it. Some days she worked from the dining table, sketchbooks spread out beside her coffee. Other times she helped Ivy with her art projects or fixed the old piano in the corner just to see if it could still carry a tune. It could, and somehow, so could all of them. One evening, Ivy sat at the kitchen island, chin propped on her hands, watching as Elena and her dad argued playfully about the best way to hang a painting in the hallway. Liam insisted on precise symmetry. Elena argued that a little imperfection gave the piece life. Ivy grinned. "You two sound like a married couple," she blurted out, voice too loud in the cozy room. Liam froze mid-hammer. Elena blinked. For a second, the only sound was Ivy's giggle echoing like music. Then Liam chuckled softly and shook his head. "Remind me to put you in charge of our public relations," he said, pretending to focus on the nail. Elena smirked. "She's not wrong, you know." Sometimes it takes a child to state the obvious. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Liam disappeared into his study, Ivy tugged at Elena's sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Elena said, drying her hands on a towel. Ivy tilted her head, serious in the way only a 10-year-old with an old soul could be. "Do you believe in wishes?" Elena smiled. "Always. Even the impossible ones? Especially those." Ivy's brow furrowed as she thought about that. Then she grinned suddenly, the kind of smile that looked like she was up to something. "Good," she said, snatching her small spiral notebook from the counter, "because I have an idea." Elena watched her scribble something furiously across a page, tongue peeking out in concentration. "What kind of idea?" "You'll see," Ivy replied mysteriously, hugging the notebook to her chest before running off to her room. A week later, Liam came home late from a meeting. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. He loosened his tie, set his keys on the counter, and was about to reach for a glass of water when he saw something taped to the refrigerator door. It was written in green marker, the letters looping unevenly but proudly. "You don't need a business plan for love, Dad, just courage." He stared at the note for a long moment, the words blurring slightly as he read them again and again. The kind of wisdom that only comes from children, the kind that doesn't sound like advice until it's exactly what you need to hear. He smiled then, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep, the kind he hadn't felt in years. He ran a hand through his hair, half laughing, half sighing, imagining Ivy writing it, giggling to herself as she taped it up like a secret mission. Elena appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, wearing one of his old shirts splattered with paint from Haven's latest project. "You found it?" she said softly. He nodded. "When did she—" "This morning," Elena said. "She made me promise not to tell." Liam looked at her, his chest tightening in that quiet, complicated way that always came when he realized how much she'd changed everything, how much she'd changed him. "She's smarter than both of us," he said. "Obviously," Elena replied with a smile that reached her eyes. He turned back to the fridge, reading the note once more before gently pressing his hand against it as if anchoring it in place. "You don't need a business plan for love," he murmured under his breath. Elena stepped closer. "She's right, you know." He looked at her, the room filling with the soft hum of rain, and something else, something steady, tender, inevitable. "Yeah," he said finally, voice low and certain. "She usually is." And there in that quiet kitchen, with the smell of paint still lingering in the air and a child's words taped to the fridge, Liam Hartwell realized that courage didn't always come in boardrooms or speeches. Sometimes it came from the smallest hand holding a crayon, teaching him how to be brave again. It happened just after midnight, the kind of hour when buildings sleep, when even the city outside seems to whisper instead of roar. The fire alarm tore through the quiet like a scream. Red lights strobed down the empty corridors of the Hartwell building, slicing through the dark, bouncing off glass and marble. For a moment, no one understood what was happening. Then came the smell, smoke, sharp and bitter, curling through the air from somewhere deep in the East Wing. Security shouted instructions, elevators shut down, and staff from the night shift scrambled into the cold. But not everyone stayed outside. Liam Hartwell didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for reports or safety updates or permission. The moment someone said, "It's coming from the old wing," his chest tightened. Studio C was in the East Wing, the place where everything had begun again, the place where she had begun again. He was already running before the guard could grab his arm. "Sir, you can't—" But he didn't hear the rest. His shoes pounded against the tile, smoke thickening with every turn. The corridor was barely visible now, flickers of orange reflecting off the glass walls. His lungs burned, but he pushed forward, shielding his face with his jacket. He reached Studio C just as the sprinklers kicked in, drenching the room in a rainstorm that hissed and steamed. The air was chaos, sirens, static, the sound of cracking plaster. He burst through the door and froze. She was already there. "Elena!" She turned at the sound of his voice, coughing through the haze, one arm shielding a stack of framed sketches. Her hair was damp, clinging to her cheeks, streaked with ash. "You shouldn't be here," she shouted, her voice breaking between coughs. "Neither should you," he yelled back, crossing the room toward her. She looked at him then, disbelief and relief clashing across her face. "You came for the sketches," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "They're all that's left," he replied, gesturing toward the smoldering wall. "Everything else can burn." "Typical," she said, a breathless laugh escaping despite the chaos. "You still think you can save everything yourself." He grinned through the sweat and soot. "You're one to talk." A ceiling tile crashed down nearby, sending up a spray of sparks. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Come on." They stumbled into the hallway just as a fire crew arrived, shouting for everyone to clear out. The sprinklers poured above them, drenching their clothes, their hair, everything. The smoke began to thin, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of extinguished flame. By the time they reached the stairwell landing, both were soaked through, coughing, but safe. They sat side by side on the steps, breathing hard, the chaos fading around them into muffled voices and dripping water. For a moment, neither spoke. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving only exhaustion and something gentler beneath it. "You're insane," she said finally, shaking her head. "Running into a fire for a few sketches." "They weren't just sketches," he said quietly. "They were us." She looked down at the frames resting against her knees, the edges singed but intact. The pencil lines inside, the curves of color, the fragments of their first ideas were blurred from water, but still there. The beginnings of Haven, the rebirth of Hartwell, the proof that something beautiful had survived chaos before. Her lips curved into a tired smile. "We're ridiculous." "Completely." He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as water dripped from his hair onto the stair. She glanced at him, this man who could lead an empire but still run headlong into danger for something fragile and forgotten. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't have to come back for me." He opened one eye, meeting hers. "I didn't come back for you." "I came back with you." That made her laugh, a low, shaky sound that somehow felt like hope. She looked down at the sketches again, tracing the wrinkled edges with her fingertips. Around them, the building still hissed and dripped, lights flickering uncertainly. When the last alarm finally went silent, the two of them just sat there, soaked to the bone, covered in soot and laughter, staring at what survived. Not the walls, not the name on the door. Just the drawings, their story, proof that from ashes, something honest could still be rebuilt. The studio lights were warmer than she expected, bright but soft, like morning sunlight after a storm. Elena sat in the chair, hands clasped loosely in her lap, the microphone clipped to her blouse just below her collarbone. The makeup artist had asked if she wanted powder to cover the faint circles under her eyes, but she'd declined. She wanted to look like herself, tired maybe, but real. Across from her sat the journalist, a woman with practiced poise and an easy smile that promised both empathy and sharpness. The cameras blinked their red lights, signaling that the interview had gone live. The world was watching, but somehow it felt smaller than that, like a conversation meant for two. "So," the journalist began, crossing one leg over the other, "you've become something of a symbol lately." The woman who was fired from Hartwell and Company and now runs its most talked-about initiative, Haven. People love a comeback story. Elena smiled, humble, restrained. "I don't think of it as a comeback, more like a continuation. I was never done. I just had to start from a different place." The interviewer leaned forward. "Is it true you were once fired from this company?" A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small studio audience. Elena didn't flinch. She nodded, eyes calm, voice steady. "Yes, on my first day, actually. 5 minutes late." "And now you run one of its most human projects," the interviewer said. "How does that happen?" Elena tilted her head slightly, thinking. "By accident, mostly," she said. "Or maybe grace. I guess sometimes being broken just shows where the light gets in." The audience went still for a moment, as if the words needed time to land. The interviewer smiled softly. "That's beautiful." "It's true," Elena continued. "When you lose something you thought you needed, it hurts. But sometimes that space, it's just making room for something better, something real." The conversation went on, flowing easily now. She talked about Haven, about the team of volunteers and designers who worked late nights painting walls in shelters, installing lights in classrooms, planting gardens behind halfway houses. She spoke about the small moments, the laughter of children seeing color on their walls for the first time, the tears of a teacher walking into a classroom that finally felt alive again. "It's not just design," Elena said, her voice softening. "It's dignity. Spaces tell people what they're worth. For too long we've been saying that beauty belongs only to those who can afford it. Haven says otherwise." When the cameras stopped rolling, the interviewer reached across the table, squeezed her hand and whispered, "You know that line about the light. It's going to stay with people." Elena just smiled, modest and quiet, unaware that within hours it would be everywhere. By noon, the clip had gone viral. News outlets replayed it between headlines, and social media filled with her image, her gentle smile, her steady eyes, her words stitched into graphics and quotes. Sometimes being broken just shows where the light gets in, messages poured in by the thousands. People who'd been fired, laid off, left behind, people who'd walked out of hospital rooms or courtrooms or dreams that had collapsed, people who'd failed and forgotten how to try again. They all said the same thing. "Thank you for reminding us to start again." Liam watched the interview from his office, the city skyline stretching behind him. When she said the line about the light, he'd stopped breathing for a moment. He'd seen that light himself, the one she carried without knowing, the one that had dragged him out of his own grayness. Downstairs in the Haven studio, Ivy and a few of the volunteers were crowded around a tablet, replaying the clip and cheering. Ivy pointed at the screen. "That's Elena," she said proudly. "She's ours." Later that evening, when Elena left the building, she found a small crowd waiting outside, students, Workers, strangers holding coffee cups and folded newspapers. They didn't ask for autographs or selfies. They just clapped quietly as she passed, like gratitude made tangible. She didn't speak, didn't wave, just pressed a hand to her heart and smiled, because in a world obsessed with success stories, she had told the truth instead, and the truth, that broken could still mean beautiful, had become the story people needed to hear. The city looked different from the rooftop. It wasn't just the height, though the view stretched endlessly, a sea of windows and neon breathing under the night sky. It was the stillness. Up here, the world felt slower, softer, the kind of quiet that holds its breath before something important happens. Elena stood near the edge, her hair catching in the breeze, the faint hum of traffic rising from far below. She didn't know why he'd asked her to meet him here after hours, only that his voice on the phone had carried something unspoken, something between urgency and hope. When the elevator doors opened behind her, she didn't turn right away. She felt him before she saw him, the air shifting slightly, the faint echo of his footsteps approaching. Liam stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, jacket open, tie gone. The night wind tugged at his shirt, carrying with it the faint smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. "I didn't know you liked heights," she said, finally turning to face him. "I don't," he admitted, his voice low, almost a laugh. "But some conversations deserve the sky." He walked closer, the city lights painting gold across his features. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, rich, the kind that had weight and meaning. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. It glinted under the rooftop lights. "What's this?" she asked. He held it out to her. "For Studio C." Her brow furrowed. "I already have access." "Not like this," he said. "The studio, it's yours now permanently. No board approval, no conditions. Whatever you want to make there, whoever you want to teach, it's yours." She looked at him, startled. "Why are you giving me this?" He hesitated. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady, because it was never really mine to begin with. "You gave it life again. You reminded me what it was supposed to be." She turned the key over in her palm, the metal cool against her skin. "You don't have to do this, Liam." "I know," he said, "but I want to." The city lights flickered below them like fireflies in glass jars. Somewhere a siren wailed faintly, but up here it felt a world away. She met his eyes then, really met them, the exhaustion and the gentleness, the weight of someone who had spent years building everything except what mattered most. "And what about us?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. He took a slow breath, searching her face like he was memorizing it. "I can build 1,000 buildings, Elena," he said, voice roughened by truth. "But none of them feel like home unless you're in them." Her throat tightened. For once she didn't deflect, didn't hide behind logic or timing or fear. The wind picked up, sweeping through her hair, and the city below blurred into streaks of light. He stepped closer until there was no space left that couldn't be crossed by a heartbeat. "You don't have to answer," he said quietly. "Not tonight. I just needed you to know." But she didn't need time, not anymore. She reached out, her fingers brushing his jacket, the small distance between them collapsing like it had been waiting for this moment all along. She leaned in until her words found his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's build one together." Liam exhaled like a man remembering how to breathe. He didn't move at first, afraid that any sudden motion might break the spell of what was unfolding between them. Then slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, the kind of embrace that felt less like possession and more like peace. Below them, the city pulsed with life. Horns, laughter, movement. But up here, it was quiet. Just two people standing in the middle of everything they'd survived, finally choosing something instead of running from it. When she pulled back, her eyes caught the skyline, endless, glowing, alive. "You think we can really do it?" she asked. He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. "We already started." And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were standing on the edge of something uncertain. They were standing on the beginning of everything that finally made sense. The morning of the grand opening felt like spring had arrived early, even though the calendar still insisted it was winter. The air carried that kind of brightness that only comes after months of quiet work and unseen effort. Sunlight pooled against the new glass doors of Haven Hall, turning them into mirrors of possibility. Inside, the space hummed with anticipation. Fresh paint, soft chatter, the nervous energy of something about to become real. Elena stood near the entrance, running her hand along the smooth edge of the welcome sign. Haven Hall, a space for design, healing, and hope. The letters gleamed gold against a backdrop of pale blue. She remembered when it had just been a sketch in her notebook, a dream scribbled between deadlines and coffee stains. Now it was alive. Liam stood a few feet away, straightening a display board that didn't really need straightening. He wasn't used to feeling nervous anymore, not after years of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. But this was different. This wasn't a launch for shareholders or a gala for press coverage. It was something fragile and human, and it mattered. Volunteers buzzed through the hallways, hanging final decorations, checking sound equipment, arranging tables filled with colored pencils and sketch pads. Haven Hall wasn't a corporate building, it was a living canvas. Every wall invited touch, every corner whispered welcome. On one wall, kids were already scribbling their names in chalk. On another, a mural stretched upward, a rising sun made from hundreds of handprints. "Looks like we're out of time, Osam," Liam said softly, glancing toward the growing crowd outside. Elena followed his gaze. Dozens of families had gathered in front of the doors. Neighbors, teachers, community members, volunteers. Reporters stood scattered among them, cameras ready, but no one seemed to care about the flashbulbs. People were smiling, talking, leaning close. The kind of crowd that shows up not for spectacle, but for belonging. At the center of it all was Ivy, holding a pair of silver scissors that looked far too big for her small hands. She wore a white dress smudged with streaks of paint from helping with the mural the night before. Her grin was wide and fearless. When the doors opened, the applause rolled through the air like thunder. Elena felt the sound in her chest. Liam stood beside her, his hand brushing hers, grounding her without saying a word. Ivy stepped forward, her voice steady and bright. "This is where new beginnings start," she announced. With one firm snip, the ribbon fluttered to the ground and the doors swung wide. Inside, the world shifted. Children ran forward first, eyes wide, laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Parents followed slower but smiling, touching the walls like they couldn't quite believe they were allowed to. The first family stopped in front of the mural, a mother tracing her fingers along the painted sun. A little boy beside her whispered, "Can I draw too?" And when someone handed him a crayon, he looked like he'd been handed the world. Within minutes, Haven Hall was alive. Chalk dust rose in soft clouds. Brushes dipped into color. Someone began to play a guitar near the corner. A group of teens set up a design board to brainstorm ideas for a neighborhood park. Every sound, every movement carried the same heartbeat, possibility. Elena watched, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam turned toward her, his eyes tracing the motion of a child painting hearts on the wall. "It's honest," he replied. She smiled, and in that single exchange they both knew what he meant. Beauty could be planned, drawn, built. But honesty had to be lived. As the day unfolded, the space filled with light and laughter, but for them, time slowed. They walked together through the halls, side by side, stopping every few feet to take it all in. The chaos, the joy, the imperfections that made it real. Near the end of the afternoon, Ivy tugged at their hands and pulled them toward the mural. "You need to add your handprints," she said. Elena laughed. "We'll ruin the symmetry." "Good," Ivy said. "It'll make it ours." They pressed their hands side by side against the wall, palms leaving faint shapes of gold and blue. When they stepped back, their prints glowed in the fading light. Elena looked at Liam, her heart steady now. "You think we did it?" He glanced around the room where strangers were becoming artists, and artists were becoming friends. "No," he said softly. "I think they did." She nodded, her eyes shimmering. And for the first time, neither of them needed to say anything more. The laughter, the colors, the walls themselves, all of it spoke for them. In that honesty, in that living, imperfect beauty, they found peace. A year can change everything, and yet, when Elena stood backstage at the Hartwell and Company annual gala, it felt like she'd never left the building at all. The same marble floors, the same soft hum of anticipation before the speeches began. But this time, the name tag on her chest didn't read assistant or applicant. It read keynote speaker. The hall shimmered with light, crystal chandeliers raining gold across the crowd. The air buzzed with conversation and camera flashes, but beneath it all was a quiet pride. Hartwell and Company wasn't just a design firm anymore. It had become something more, an idea, a story, a movement. The company had changed, but so had the man who built it and the woman who reminded him why it mattered. From where she stood, Elena could see Liam seated in the front row beside Ivy. He wasn't the image of the untouchable CEO anymore. He looked lighter, unguarded, his hand resting gently over his daughter's. Ivy was taller now, her hair curled loosely over her shoulders, eyes bright with the same quiet mischief that had started it all. A stagehand whispered her cue. She took a slow breath and stepped into the light. Applause greeted her, long and warm, the kind that said people weren't clapping for a title. They were clapping for a journey. She smiled, the memory of that first day flickering in her mind, the bus running late, the judgmental eyes, the sting of humiliation. How far she had come from that morning, how far they had come. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady but soft. "A year ago, I was sitting exactly where you are now. I was the girl who'd been fired on her first day, who thought her story had already ended." A quiet laugh rippled through the audience. She smiled, but her eyes stayed gentle. "But sometimes endings," she continued, "are just detours." Liam's throat tightened as he listened. He'd heard her say hundreds of things that moved people, but nothing quite like this. Ivy squeezed his hand under the table, and he squeezed back, as if to say, this is what it was all for. Elena went on to talk about Haven Hall, the lives it had touched, the spaces it had transformed, the people it had welcomed. She spoke about design, not as decoration, but as empathy turned tangible. "We build walls for shelter," she said, "but the real work is making sure those walls don't keep people out." When she finished, the applause rose again, louder this time, not just polite but heartfelt. Liam stood clapping until his palms stung, and for a moment the whole room seemed to fade away until it was just him, her, and the echo of everything they'd built together. Later that night, after the guests had left and the music had softened to a slow, fading hum, Elena slipped away from the remaining crowd. She found Liam on the balcony overlooking the city, the skyline shimmering like a constellation of possibilities. "Speechless?" she teased, joining him. He smiled, his tie undone, his eyes tired in the way that meant happy. "I've learned not to compete with you in words." She laughed softly, leaning on the railing beside him. The city below pulsed with life, honking cars, laughter spilling from restaurants, the faint hum of music drifting upward. "Do you ever think about that morning?" she asked quietly. He turned his head toward her. "Every day." She tilted her chin toward him, curious. "Why?" He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her chest ache in the best way. "Because it's the day I met the woman who taught me that lateness isn't failure, it's timing." Elena looked away, blinking back tears, her laughter breaking through instead. "You still talk like a poet." "Only when I mean it," he said. For a long while they stood there, the city moving beneath them, the air cool and forgiving. Below, a car honked impatiently. Someone laughed too loudly, and somewhere far off, the clock struck midnight. Liam reached for her hand. She took it, fingers fitting easily into his, as if they'd always belonged there. When they finally left the hall, the last of the lights dimmed behind them, casting their shadows long across the pavement. The city met them with open arms, neon reflections, and night air, and the kind of quiet that holds no endings, only continuations. They walked hand in hand, laughter echoing softly between them. Not as a man and woman rebuilding what was broken, but as two people who had learned how to make music out of everything they'd once lost. And in that harmony beneath the glowing skyline of the city that had watched them both fall and rise again, they finally understood. It had never been about arriving on time. It had always been about finding each other when the moment was right. If this story touched something in you, even just a little, take a moment to share it. Tell me where in the world you're reading from, and what part of Elena and Liam's journey stayed with you most. And if you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that it's never too late to start again, hit that subscribe button. Your kindness, your time, your presence, they mean more than you know. Until the next story, stay hopeful, stay human, and keep building your own kind of harmony.